The dragon snowbound cavern, the village of Aurith, was silent under its blanket of eternal frost. Snow covered every rooftop, every road, every inch of what had once been a vibrant town. The villagers, faces pale as the snow, moved like shadows through the biting cold, their breath visible even inside their homes. Fires burned low in hearths, unable to warm more than a single room. Crops had failed long ago, and food was scarce. Despair hung heavy in the air, as constant as the falling snow. It was said that the winter had begun a decade ago. Not the gentle winters of old, but an unyielding blight. The seasons no longer shifted. Spring, summer, and autumn were mere memories. In its place, an endless white stretched into infinity. The elders whispered of the dragon of the snowbound cavern, a being older than the world itself. According to legend, this dragon held the knowledge of winter's origins, the secret to why it had come, and why it now refused to leave. For years the stories were just that, stories. Tales told to keep the children entertained during long frozen nights. But now, as hunger gnawed at their bellies and the cold claimed more lives, the villagers began to wonder if the dragon might hold the key to their salvation. Cael had always been drawn to the legend. Young and restless, he'd grown up hearing his grandmother recount tales of the frosted peaks, where the snowbound cavern lay hidden. Though her voice had been weak in her final days, her eyes gleamed with conviction when she told him, "The dragon's truth is the key, child. But truth is not given, it must be earned." Now, standing at the edge of the village, wrapped in a tattered cloak against the unrelenting wind, Cael felt her words echo in his mind. He had no map, no guide, and little more than a bag of provisions. Yet something within him stirred, a pull he could not explain. The frosted peaks loomed far in the distance, their jagged silhouettes barely visible through the swirling snow. Somewhere in that vast wilderness lay the snowbound cavern. If the stories were true, the villagers watched him from their windows as he left, their faces etched with fear and hope. Some whispered prayers, others shook their heads, believing the young man was walking to his death. But Cael didn't turn back. The journey was harsher than he had imagined. The snowdrifts grew deeper with each step, and the wind howled like a living thing, its icy fingers clawing at his skin. He clutched the fur-lined cloak tighter around him, but the cold seeped in regardless, a persistent reminder of the winter's dominance. The trees grew sparse, their branches laden with icicles that chimed like bells in the wind. By the third day, Cael's strength was waning. His provisions had dwindled to a handful of stale bread and a frozen canteen. He paused to rest beneath a jagged overhang of rock, its surface slick with frost. As he huddled against the stone, his thoughts drifted to the stories, tales of great heroes who had ventured into the unknown and returned triumphant. He wondered if they had felt this same creeping doubt, this weight of uncertainty that pressed on him now. It was then that he heard it, a sound faint and distant, like the murmur of a river beneath thick ice. Cael froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sound wasn't natural. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. He strained to hear it again, and there it was, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath him. Rising to his feet, he followed the sound, his exhaustion forgotten. The hum grew louder, resonating through the icy air like the toll of a faraway bell. It led him toward a narrow pass, its entrance obscured by a curtain of falling snow. Beyond the pass, the frosted peaks rose higher, their icy faces reflecting the dim light of the overcast sky. As Cael stepped into the pass, the wind died abruptly, leaving only silence and the faint hum. The air here felt different, charged with an energy he couldn't define. He pressed on, the pull in his chest growing stronger with every step. And then, through the swirling snow, he saw it, a faint blue glow emanating from a fissure in the mountain ahead. It was no natural light. It pulsed like a heartbeat, casting faint shadows on the surrounding ice. Cael knew, without a doubt, that he had found the entrance to the Snowbound Cavern. The frozen cool had led him here. And though fear whispered at the edges of his mind, he took a deep breath and stepped forward into the unknown. The blue glow pulsed faintly, like the steady rhythm of a sleeping heart. As Cael approached the fissure in the mountainside, the snow around him seemed to quiet, the constant howl of the wind fading to an eerie stillness. He reached out a trembling hand, brushing aside the frost-covered tendrils of a creeping vine that veiled the cavern's entrance. The air inside was sharp and cold, biting into his lungs with each breath. He stepped cautiously, the crunch of his boots on the icy floor echoing back at him in whispers that seemed too alive for mere sound. The cavern's walls gleamed with crystalline patterns, their surfaces catching the faint blue light and scattering it into a kaleidoscope of spectral colors. It was as though the ice itself had memories, frozen fragments of something ancient and powerful. As Cael ventured deeper, the passage narrowed, forcing him to duck beneath jagged icicles that hung like the fangs of some great beast. The blue glow intensified, illuminating carvings on the walls, runes and images etched into the ice with a precision that no human hand could achieve. The figures depicted dragons, their wings spread wide as they soared above snowy landscapes. One carving showed a great dragon breathing frost over a barren land, transforming it into a glittering expanse of snow and ice. The origins of winter, Cael thought. His breath caught as he realized the carvings told a story, one that no mortal had seen for centuries. Deeper still, the air grew heavier, each step feeling like a greater effort than the last. He began to hear faint noises, a distant rumble, a low hiss that rose and fell like a living breath. It was impossible to tell if the sounds were real or the workings of his overtaxed mind. But they drove him onward. The passage opened suddenly into a vast chamber, and Cael froze. The cavern was immense, its domed ceiling lost in shadow. Pillars of ice rose from the ground like ancient trees, their surfaces rippling with the faint glow that filled the space. At the chamber's center lay a pool of water, black as night and perfectly still. Above it, suspended in the air, was a figure that stole Cael's breath. The dragon was magnificent and terrible. Its body was encased in crystalline scales that shimmered like shattered glass, each facet catching the blue light and turning it into something unearthly. Its wings, vast and translucent, hung motionless, their edges razor-sharp. The dragon's eyes were closed, its expression serene, yet formidable, as though it dreamed of distant, incomprehensible worlds. As Cael stared, the dragon's eyes opened. They were not eyes as he knew them, but swirling orbs of white and silver like the heart of a blizzard. When it spoke, its voice was not a sound, but a vibration that resonated deep within his chest. "Why do you come, mortal?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Cael opened his mouth, but his voice faltered, the words catching in his throat. He swallowed hard and tried again. "I come seeking the truth," he said, his voice small in the vast chamber. "The winter has taken everything from my people. We are dying. The legends say you know the origins of winter, that you hold the key to its balance." The dragon's gaze pierced him, and for a moment, Cael felt as though the creature was sifting through his very soul, weighing every thought and memory he possessed. "The truth is not easily given," the dragon said, its tone neither kind nor cruel, but ancient and unyielding. "Winter is balance, as is all in this world, yet balance has been lost, and you seek answers you may not wish to find." "I have no choice," Cael said, his voice firmer now. "If I do nothing, my people will perish." The dragon's eyes narrowed, and it inclined its massive head slightly, as if in contemplation. "To seek truth is to risk the weight of it, mortal. But if you would learn, you must first endure." The air around Cael grew colder, the chill sinking into his bones. The dragon's wings unfurled with a sound like cracking ice, and the light in the chamber dimmed as shadows gathered around him. "Follow me," the dragon commanded, its voice echoing through the cavern. The creature turned, its massive form gliding effortlessly toward a passage on the far side of the chamber. The pool of black water rippled faintly in its wake, as though even the stillness of the cavern could not resist the dragon's power. Cael hesitated only a moment before following, his footsteps hesitant but resolute. He could feel the weight of the dragon's presence ahead of him, a force that seemed to bend the very air. The path before him was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The answers he sought would come at a price. The truth of winter awaited, and with it, a trial that would test more than just his courage. The dragon's wings created no sound as it led Cael deeper into the cavern, but the air seemed to tremble in its wake. The blue light pulsed in rhythm with Cael's heart, illuminating a path that twisted and descended into the earth. The ice around them grew darker, its surface opaque and streaked with silvery veins, as though the cavern itself was alive and aware of their presence. Finally, the passage opened into a second chamber, smaller than the first but far more haunting. In the center stood a pedestal of jagged ice, and atop it rested the shard. It was no larger than Cael's hand, yet its power was undeniable. The shard seemed to contain a storm within it, a swirling vortex of frost and wind that roared silently against its crystalline prison. The air around it crackled with an unnatural cold, and the blue glow that had guided them intensified, emanating from the shard itself. The dragon paused, its towering form casting long shadows across the walls. When it spoke, its voice carried an edge of reverence. This is the shard of the first frost, a fragment of the winter that began the cycle of the seasons. It was forged to balance the searing heat of the sun and bring rest to the world. But balance is a fragile thing, mortal. The shard has been disturbed, its power unleashed without purpose, and now winter has consumed what it was meant to preserve. Cael stepped closer, his eyes locked on the shard. He could feel its power pressing against him, a force so immense that it made his knees tremble. "How can I fix it?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The dragon's gaze burned into him. To restore the shard's balance is to restore the balance of winter itself. But it is not the shard that needs repair. It is the one who wields it. "I don't understand," Cael said, his breath clouding the air before him. The dragon lowered its head until its eyes were level with his. "Winter does not act without cause. It reflects the hearts of those who live within it. The shard, once stable, has become tainted by the greed and despair of mortals who sought to command its power. If you wish to restore it, you must cleanse yourself of the darkness within you. Only then can you touch the shard and guide it back to harmony." The chamber grew colder, and Cael felt the weight of the dragon's words settle on him. He thought of his village, of the desperation he'd seen in their faces, and of his own fear that he would fail them. Was he strong enough to face what lay within himself? "The shard will show you," the dragon continued. "But it will not be kind. You will see your heart laid bare, your truths and your lies, your strength and your failings. Only if you endure will you gain the power to restore the shard and bring balance to winter." Cael's hands trembled as he stepped forward. The shard's glow seemed to pulse in time with his footsteps, growing brighter with each step. When he reached the pedestal, he hesitated, his breath catching in his throat. "Will it hurt?" he asked. "The truth always does," the dragon said simply. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Cael reached out and touched the shard. The world dissolved around him. He was no longer in the cavern, but standing in the middle of his village. Snow fell heavily around him, and the houses were dark, their windows frosted over. He turned and saw himself standing at the edge of a field, calling out a name, Lyra. A memory surfaced, sharp and painful. Lyra had been his closest friend, lost in a snowstorm when they were children. He had been with her, but he'd been too afraid to leave the safety of the path to search for her. She'd vanished into the storm, her cries growing fainter until there was only silence. The vision shifted. He was in the village square. The townsfolk gathered around him. Their eyes were full of hope, but their voices were edged with desperation. "You must find the dragon," they said. "You must save us." He saw himself nodding, but in his heart he felt only fear. What if he failed? What if he wasn't enough? The shard reflected it all. His guilt, his doubt, his anger at the unfairness of it all. The cold seeped into his soul, threatening to overwhelm him. But as the storm of emotions raged, a new feeling emerged, resolve. He couldn't change the past, but he could act now. He could choose courage, even in the face of fear. The vision shattered, and Cael was back in the cavern, the shard still beneath his hand. Its glow had changed, softening to a pale silver. The dragon watched him silently, its eyes unreadable. "You have faced the truth," it said. "Now you may restore the shard." Cael's breath came in ragged gasps, but he stood taller now, his resolve steady. He would not fail. Not this time. The silver glow of the shard pulsed gently under Cael's hand, but the air around it still carried the weight of something ancient and untamed. The dragon loomed nearby, its crystalline wings folded against its massive form, watching in solemn silence. "The shard has acknowledged you," the dragon said, its voice resonating through the cavern. "But it is not yet yours to command. The balance it holds must be restored, and to do that, you must prove that your heart is steady and your intent pure." Cael straightened, though his body still trembled from the vision the shard had forced him to endure. He had faced the storm within himself and survived, but the trial was not yet over. "What must I do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the frost creeping into his veins. The dragon's glowing eyes seemed to narrow, though not in malice. "You must carry the shard to the heart of this cavern, where winter was born. The journey will test you, for the shard's power will grow heavier with each step. You will see more of yourself, not as you wish to be, but as you truly are. Only by accepting all that you see can you bring the shard to its rightful place." Cael glanced at the shard, its faint light casting long shadows on the ice. A flicker of fear passed through him, but he nodded. I'll do it." With deliberate care, he lifted the shard from its pedestal. The moment his fingers wrapped around its edges, a jolt of cold surged through his arm, sharp and biting. It wasn't the chill of snow, but something deeper. A cold that burrowed into his very soul. His vision blurred for a moment, and he stumbled. "Steady yourself," the dragon said, a note of warning in its voice. Cael clenched his teeth and adjusted his grip on the shard. The cold radiated from it, growing stronger with every passing moment. He took a tentative step forward, then another, the icy cavern stretching before him like an endless labyrinth. As he walked, the cavern began to change. The wall shimmered, and shapes began to form within the ice. Shadows of figures and faces he recognized. His mother, her hands calloused from years of tending to the village's meager gardens, her face lined with worry. His father, a stoic man who had taught him how to light a fire, whose strength had dwindled as the endless winter dragged on. And then, Lyra. Her face appeared in the ice, her eyes wide and searching, just as they had been on the day she disappeared. Cael froze, his breath catching in his throat. "You left me," her voice whispered, soft as falling snow. "I didn't mean to," Cael said, his voice breaking. "I was scared. I didn't know how to save you." The ice around her image cracked, and her face melted away, replaced by another, his own reflection. It stared back at him, pale and gaunt, its eyes filled with doubt. "You're not strong enough," it said, the words echoing in the chamber. Cael clenched his fists, the shards cold biting into his palms. "I am strong enough," he said, his voice firm. "I may not have been before, but I am now." The reflection twisted, its features distorting before shattering into fragments of light. Cael stumbled forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The shard felt heavier now, its weight pressing against his chest like an invisible burden. Finally, he reached a great archway carved into the ice, its surface covered in intricate runes that pulsed faintly. Beyond it lay the heart of the cavern, a vast expanse of pure white light that seemed to pulse like a living thing. The air here was impossibly cold, each breath freezing in his lungs. Cael stepped through the archway, the shard trembling in his hands. The light enveloped him, and for a moment he felt as though he were floating in a sea of frost and silence. "Place the shard," the dragon's voice echoed, though the creature itself was nowhere to be seen. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal of ice, its surface shimmering with the same silver glow as the shard. Cael approached it, each step more difficult than the last. The shard's weight was unbearable now, its cold threatening to consume him entirely. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself forward. When he reached the pedestal, he raised the shard with trembling hands and placed it carefully in the center. The moment the shard touched the pedestal, A wave of light erupted from it, cascading through the cavern like a river of stars. The cold receded, replaced by a warmth that seeped into Cael's very bones. The shard's silver glow softened, its light steady and calm. The dragon appeared once more, its crystalline form gliding silently into the chamber. Its eyes met Cael's, and it inclined its head slightly, a gesture of approval. "You have done well, mortal," the dragon said. "The balance of winter is restored, but the balance within yourself, that is the true triumph." Cael sank to his knees, exhaustion washing over him. He had faced his fears, his doubts and his pain, and he had emerged stronger. For the first time in years, he felt the faint flicker of hope. The shard, now dormant but stable, shimmered on its pedestal, a testament to his journey and the strength it had forged within him. The cavern was no longer the oppressive, cold void it had been when Cael first entered. The air still carried a chill, but it was softer now, no longer biting into his skin with each breath. The shard rested on the pedestal, its silver light steady and serene, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. It was whole again, its balance restored. The dragon circled the chamber, its crystalline wings trailing glimmers of light as it moved. Its presence was no longer as daunting as before, but still, Cael could not shake the feeling of standing before something beyond his comprehension, an embodiment of the ancient forces that shape the world. "The shard is at peace," the dragon said, its voice resonating like a distant storm. "Winter will once again flow in harmony with the seasons. But know this, mortal, balance is a delicate thing. It can be disrupted by the smallest act of greed or fear. You have restored it today, but the responsibility does not end here." Cael nodded, though his body ached with exhaustion. "What must I do?" he asked, his voice hoarse but resolute. The dragon's glowing eyes met his, their swirling depths unreadable. "You have seen your own heart. You have faced its truth. That is the foundation of balance. To protect it, you must guide others to see their own truths, to understand that winter, like all things, is a part of life's cycle. Only then can harmony endure." The weight of the dragon's words settled over Cael, heavier than the shard had been. He thought of his village, the despair that had taken root there, and the hope that still flickered faintly in their hearts. Perhaps this was why he had been chosen, not just to restore the shard, but to carry its lesson back to his people. The dragon lowered its head, its crystalline scales catching the shard's glow and scattering it across the chamber. "Take this." A faint shimmer appeared in the air before Cael. As he reached out, it solidified into a small crystal, no larger than a pebble, its surface glinting with the same silver light as the shard. "This fragment holds a spark of the shard's essence," the dragon explained. "It will guide you when doubt clouds your path and remind you of the truth you have seen. Use it wisely, for its power is not yours to wield, but to protect. Cael accepted the crystal, its cool surface sending a faint warmth through his fingers. He slipped it into the pouch at his side, its weight a comforting presence against him. "Now," the dragon said, its wings spreading wide, "you must leave this place. Winter's balance has been restored, and my task here is done. But remember, mortal, this is not the end of your journey. It is only the beginning." As Cael retraced his steps through the cavern, the path felt different, lighter. The oppressive cold had lifted, and the ice around him no longer shimmered with spectral images of his past. The blue glow that had once guided him was now a faint silver, casting soft light on the walls. When he emerged from the cavern, the frosted peaks stretched before him, bathed in the pale light of dawn. For the first time in years, the clouds overhead had parted, revealing the soft hues of a winter sunrise. The snow beneath his feet sparkled like scattered diamonds, and the air carried a stillness that was not lifeless but peaceful. The journey back to the village was arduous, but Cael felt a new strength within him. He carried more than the shard's fragment. He carried the lessons of his trial, the understanding that winter was not an enemy to be defeated, but a part of the world's balance, just as essential as the warmth of summer. When he finally reached the village, the sight of it struck him anew. The houses were still cloaked in snow, the fields still barren, but the faces that greeted him were filled with hope. The villagers gathered around him, their voices rising in a chorus of questions and relief. Cael stood before them, the crystal in his hand, catching the light of the rising sun. He told them of the cavern, of the shard, and of the dragon who guarded the truth of winter. He spoke of balance and the strength it required, of the courage to face one's own fears and doubts. As he spoke, the snow seemed to fall more gently, the icy wind softening to a faint breeze. For the first time in years, the villagers began to believe that the endless winter might truly end. In the months that followed, the seasons began to shift once more. The snow melted, revealing the dark, rich earth beneath. The fields bloomed, the rivers thawed, and the village came alive with the sounds of spring. Cael became a figure of quiet strength among his people, known as the winter's herald. He kept the dragon's crystal close, a reminder of the journey that had shaped him and the truth he had seen. And though he knew he might never return to the Snowbound Cavern, its memory lingered in his heart, a testament to the power of balance and the strength it took to protect it.